When I opened the door to the old hotel and saw his suitcase standing by the front desk, my breath caught, but not because I wasn't expecting anyone. I was. Just not him. The suitcase was exactly the same kind he used to take on our trips, navy blue with a broken zipper on the side, a frayed handle, and a small, faded tag with his initials. I froze in the doorway, my hand still wrapped around the cold brass knob. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since the divorce papers were signed in that stale office downtown. My brother said the place would be empty. He said I'd be alone, that I needed solitude, space, time. But now I stood there, heart pounding, eyes locked on a bag I'd packed and unpacked for years of shared trips, shared memories, and shared disappointments. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't his. Maybe someone else had the same suitcase, the same initials. But when I stepped further inside and heard the faint sound of humming from the hallway, his humming, everything inside me twisted. That voice, that tone, that habit of carrying melodies under his breath when he thought no one was listening. I backed up, nearly stumbling over my own feet. I should have left. I didn't. I waited. Waited to see if he'd come around the corner, and when he did, when his eyes met mine, neither of us said a word. Not at first. My brother knew. He planned this. And I stood there, in a place that once held our happiest memories, now wondering whether I was walking into something healing, or something far more dangerous. Before I tell you the rest, I want you to tell me this. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like someone rewound time, just for you to relive your biggest mistake? Share where you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever been trapped between your past and what still pulls at you from underneath your skin? The first night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid. Not even because I was angry. I didn't sleep because my body couldn't settle into the space I thought I'd escaped years ago. The air, the scent of aged wood and lemon polish, the creak of the stairs I used to rush up in laughter, in love, in arguments. Everything about the hotel was too familiar. It had been untouched, yet something about it felt deliberately arranged, too clean in some corners, too disheveled in others. As if someone curated the chaos to match the ruins in my memory. I tried to focus on the reason I'd come. My brother told me I needed to rest, to take time away from the noise. He said this place would give me peace, that it was far enough from the city, from responsibilities, from reminders. That it was just for me. And I believed him. At least, I wanted to. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, folding sweaters I didn't need, organizing drawers I wouldn't use. I watched the sun sink beyond the trees from the window of my room, the same room we stayed in for our honeymoon. Room 6. I hadn't asked for that room. My brother gave it to me without mentioning its significance. Maybe he thought I wouldn't remember. I did. As night deepened, the silence became heavier. It wasn't comforting. It was watchful. I kept checking my phone for a signal, even though I knew it wouldn't come. I knew that in this part of the countryside, reception was fickle. But still, I tried. Every few minutes. Desperation disguised as habit. Around midnight, I wandered downstairs to make tea. The kitchen was dimly lit, one overhead bulb flickered every few seconds. The mugs were stacked neatly beside the sink, a detail I hadn't expected. My brother wasn't the tidy type. Or at least he hadn't been before. I wondered if he'd hired someone to prepare the place. But something about it felt too personal. The familiarity of the arrangement, the way the sugar jar still had a crack in the lid, glued back together like we'd done during our last visit. It unsettled me. I sat at the small wooden table and tried to drink, but the tea had gone cold. I hadn't even noticed the time passing. My thoughts were spiraling. I should have felt safe. I was alone in a locked building, miles from anyone. But I didn't feel safe. Not from anything outside. From myself. Memories rose like ghosts. Not just of him, but of me, who I used to be here. Carefree. Reckless. Hopeful. I remembered the night we'd danced in the hallway with no music, the morning we'd watched rain slide down the windows, wrapped in a blanket too small for two. I remembered the way he touched my back as I made coffee, the way I leaned into him without thinking. I hadn't thought of those moments in years. Not since the end, when everything became sharp, cold, silent. When we passed each other in hallways like strangers with unfinished sentences. A sound jolted me, a creak from the stairwell. Not loud, but real. I held my breath. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, moved above me. I froze. I wasn't alone. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, old buildings make noise. But I knew those footsteps. Knew their rhythm. Their hesitation. The pause near the top stair where he used to tie his shoelaces before coming down. I stood quickly, too quickly. The chair screeched against the floor. I waited, ears straining, but the sound stopped. When I stepped into the hallway, everything was still. No one came down. No voices. No doors opening. Just the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and my own uneven breathing. I returned to my room and locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I sat on the bed, the mattress sagging in the middle like it always did, and stared at the ceiling. My heart wouldn't slow down. I thought of calling my brother. Demanding an explanation. Asking why I felt watched in a place meant for solitude. But I didn't call. Something inside me didn't want to ask. Because something inside me already knew. This wasn't a coincidence. His suitcase hadn't just appeared. His humming hadn't just echoed from nowhere. He was here. And my brother had brought me back, not to rest, but to relive. I curled beneath the sheets fully clothed, still not warm. Still not sure what I was more afraid of, seeing him again, or seeing who I'd become since I last looked at him and believed I was done feeling anything at all. The morning light broke through the thin curtains far earlier than I expected, and with it came a weight I hadn't felt in years. Not heaviness in my body, but in my chest, in my stomach, a low, persistent tightness that made every breath feel like an effort. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, listening. No footsteps. No humming. Just the steady hum of electricity and the occasional creak of the building shifting under the touch of wind. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. My joints felt stiff, not from age but from the tension I carried, curled tightly through the night. The shower wasn't warm, but it was enough to pull me into focus. I dressed without thinking, simple jeans, a soft cotton sweater, clothes that said I was here to be comfortable, not noticed. But when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw the contradiction. I had added mascara. My lips held a soft gloss. I couldn't pretend it was for myself. Downstairs, the smell of coffee was already in the air. The kitchen door was ajar, the light from inside pooling into the hallway. I hesitated, hand resting on the edge of the doorframe. I could turn back. I could make tea in my room, pretend not to notice anything beyond the walls I'd chosen. But I didn't. I walked into the kitchen, and there he was, standing barefoot by the counter, pouring coffee into a chipped mug I recognized from years ago. He looked the same. Maybe a little older, a little more tired around the eyes. But the way he moved, the shape of his shoulders beneath the fabric of his shirt, all of it pressed against me like an old song I never wanted to remember. He turned. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. He held out the mug. I took it. The first sip burned my tongue, but I didn't react. I couldn't. My nerves were already humming too loudly. We stood in silence, facing opposite counters, drinking like two people who didn't know where to begin. But we did know. We just didn't want to say it out loud. Eventually, he broke the silence. "You look rested," he said, without turning. I didn't answer. The truth was I wasn't. I had barely slept. My dreams, when they came, were fractured and full of echoes. He didn't press. He just kept sipping, his movements deliberate, his presence both familiar and unbearable. The sound of the wind outside filled the room. It whistled through the cracks in the old window frames. For a while, we just listened. I glanced toward the door, then back at him. "You're staying here?" I asked, though I already knew. He nodded. "Couple nights," he replied. "Your brother said I could use the space." "My brother?" "Of course." I set the mug down more forcefully than I meant to. The clink echoed. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said, keeping my voice even. "I didn't know you'd be here either," he replied without missing a beat, and I hated how effortlessly he lied. There was a tension in the air that made the room feel smaller. My skin felt too tight. My thoughts moved too fast. I wanted to be anywhere else, but my feet didn't move. I didn't ask him why he came. I didn't ask why now. Because I already suspected the answer. And that was worse than hearing it confirmed. He moved to the table, sat down, and looked out the window like it was just another day. Like we were just two people in a kitchen with shared history and nothing more. I didn't sit. Instead, I walked to the counter, my hand grazing the edge where I once left notes for him, reminders, apologies, small words folded in paper. I traced a scratch in the wood, remembered how it got there. A dropped knife, a bad joke, laughter that turned into a fight that ended in silence. So many moments etched into surfaces we thought we'd never see again. "I almost didn't come," I said, not sure why I admitted it. "But you did," he replied. That was all he said. And it was enough. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. He stood slowly, walked to the other side of the room. Our eyes met, just for a second, and something shifted. Neither of us moved first. But somehow, we met in the middle. We didn't speak. We didn't explain. We didn't apologize. We kissed. It was quiet. It was short. It was wrong. But it happened. And after, we both took a step back. Neither of us said a word. He turned, walked out of the kitchen, and disappeared up the stairs. I stood there for a long time, the taste of coffee and regret lingering on my lips. My hand trembled when I reached for the counter again, needing something to hold on to. The walls seemed closer now, like the building itself had seen too much. I cleaned the mug. Dried it slowly. Placed it back in the exact spot he found it. Everything in its place. As if nothing had happened. But something had. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. I stayed inside for most of the morning. The hotel was cold, even with the sunlight trying to push its way through the dusty windows. I made another pot of coffee just to have something to do with my hands. I didn't drink it. I just poured it, held the mug, and stared out the window above the sink. The yard outside was overgrown, the old metal swing creaking gently in the wind like it remembered a child who no longer returned. The silence between the trees was thick. Everything felt like it was holding its breath. Upstairs, the floor creaked again, but I didn't look. I didn't need to. I knew where he was, just as I knew that nothing would be said between us, not now, maybe not ever. What happened in the kitchen was a moment, not a conversation. And maybe that was the point. Maybe moments were all we had left. By late morning, the front door opened, and my brother stepped in, shaking off dust and brushing wind from his jacket like he'd just come in from a long trip. He acted normal, calm, casual. He didn't ask how I was. He just dropped his keys on the table by the entrance, muttered something about needing to fix the lock on the back gate, and disappeared into one of the side rooms. I stood frozen in the hallway, the coffee cooling in my hands again. He knew. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. The timing of it all, his absence, his silence, the way he avoided looking directly at me. It didn't feel accidental. And suddenly the house felt even smaller, as if the walls had drawn tighter overnight, closing in on every lie we were trying not to tell. After lunch, he suggested we go for a walk. No reason. No destination. Just a stretch of the legs, he said, the way people do when they're trying to pass time without revealing why it matters. We walked through the back fields where the grass grew waist-high and dry leaves crunched beneath our feet. He talked about the weather, about the broken fence he planned to repair. I said little, nodding when it seemed appropriate. My thoughts were too busy assembling fragments of the kitchen, the silence, the look in my brother's eyes. Then, as if he'd sensed I was about to speak, he stopped walking. "You remember this trail?" he asked, looking out at the path that curved along the edge of the trees. I did. It was the same one we used years ago when we first stayed at the hotel as kids. I remembered dragging our suitcases up this path, giggling, swatting at mosquitoes, complaining about the heat. I remembered how small the hotel had seemed then, how big the world felt beyond it. I nodded. I remember. He didn't speak again. We kept walking, but I noticed the shift. His questions were leading me somewhere, not just along the path, but toward something else. Something he wanted me to feel, or say, or realize. Back at the hotel, he disappeared again, leaving me alone with the echo of our footsteps and a silence that now felt rehearsed. By late afternoon, I found myself back in the room upstairs. Room 6. The air was still and thick. I opened the window, hoping to invite in something, breeze, distraction, clarity. Instead, I found myself watching the driveway below. That's when I saw it. His car. Parked again. He hadn't left after all. I didn't know why that hit me so hard. Maybe because I believed, or needed to believe, that what had happened was a final ripple in still water, not the start of something larger. But now it felt different. It felt like repetition. Like something repeating itself deliberately. I went downstairs, slowly, each step creaking like it was warning me. The kitchen was empty. The mug from the morning had been cleaned and put away. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Perfectly still. Artificially still. I stood in the doorway to the common room, the one with the stone fireplace that never worked and the green velvet chair no one ever sat in. And then I heard him, from the hallway behind me. I turned too quickly, caught my breath, and there he was, walking in like nothing had happened. Like this wasn't a second day, a second silence, a second chance to step back. He nodded at me, casually, and headed toward the bookshelf to look at the old paperbacks. As if that made sense. As if that was what people did after they broke something unspoken. I stood there and said nothing. Because what could I say? I didn't ask him why he was still here. I didn't ask why he didn't leave, or why he came at all. I knew none of those questions would have honest answers. We weren't people who told the truth anymore. Not to each other. Maybe not even to ourselves. Dinner passed without incident. My brother cooked. A quiet meal. No eye contact. Just the sound of silverware and the occasional scrape of a chair. He didn't ask me about the walk. He didn't mention anything about the previous night. It was as if we were actors in a play that had already finished its run, going through the motions just to see if anyone was still watching. Afterward, I washed the dishes alone. The water ran hot, the steam curling around my fingers. I let it burn a little longer than necessary, just to feel something clear. When I turned around, the room was empty again. Upstairs, the hallway was dark, save for the light under the door at the far end, my room. I walked past it. I walked past his door. I walked all the way down the hallway to the locked storage room at the end, the one that had always been closed since the renovation. The key was in my pocket. I don't know why I had it. My brother gave it to me when I arrived, saying only, in case you need to find something. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled of dust and cedar. Stacks of old linens, boxes of mismatched tableware, a few framed paintings leaning against the wall. And on a shelf, tucked between two crates, was a photograph. Us. From our honeymoon. Smiling. His arm around my waist. My face tilted toward him. That photo hadn't been there by accident. I held it for a long time, my fingers tightening around the frame. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something inside me, something soft and old, bent just a little. Not enough to break. Just enough to change shape. The next morning began not with light, but with sound. I woke to the low hum of a vacuum cleaner downstairs, steady, monotonous, almost meditative. It was an odd choice for that early hour, especially in a house where no one cared much for cleanliness before. I stayed in bed for several minutes, watching the soft flicker of sunlight on the ceiling as it filtered through the sheer curtains. There was no rush to move. I had nowhere to be. Yet everything inside me pulsed with urgency. Eventually, I stood. My body ached, not from effort but from the weight of things I wasn't letting myself name. The kind of weight that settled behind the eyes and in the hollows of the throat. I dressed quickly, in clothes that didn't matter, and made my way toward the hallway. Downstairs, the sound had stopped. I walked slowly, half expecting the silence to erupt into something else, a confrontation, a confession, a collapse. But it didn't. The house was calm. Too calm. In the kitchen, the light was already on. My brother stood by the sink, wiping down the counter with slow, purposeful movements. The coffee pot was half full, and 2 mugs sat on the table. His face was unreadable, his body language neutral. He didn't look up as I entered. I poured myself a cup, the steam rising like a barrier between us. I didn't speak. Neither did he. We existed together in that room for several minutes, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. When he finally broke the silence, it wasn't what I expected. "I fixed the back gate," he said. I nodded once. My hand trembled slightly as I raised the cup to my lips. The coffee tasted the same as always, but something about it felt foreign. Like I was drinking a memory that no longer belonged to me. After breakfast, I wandered outside, needing distance, not from the people in the house, but from the version of myself I kept confronting inside its walls. The morning was cool, the sky pale and cloudless. I walked aimlessly, past the abandoned garden bed and the rusted swing set that still stood crooked near the edge of the property. I followed a narrow path I barely remembered. It curved around the hill behind the hotel and led to a small clearing that overlooked the valley below. I used to come here alone, when the world felt too loud. Back then, it was the quiet I craved. Now, it was the space. The bench was still there. Weathered, cracked, covered in a thin layer of moss, but standing. I sat down and closed my eyes. The wind was soft. I could hear birds in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves, the creak of wood beneath me. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Not really. My mind kept looping back to the photo, to the moment I held it, to the understanding that nothing in that storage room had been forgotten. It had been staged. Positioned. Waiting. And I hated how effective it had been. It wasn't just the image. It was the way it had been placed. Not front and center, but buried just enough to seem accidental. Just enough to seem like something I'd rediscovered on my own. But it wasn't discovery. It was design. When I returned to the house, my brother was gone again. I didn't ask where. I didn't want to know. The rest of the day unfolded with unsettling predictability. The rooms remained quiet. The halls were too still. Every sound, a closing door, a creaking stair, felt intentional. I couldn't decide whether the house was watching me or I was watching it. Late in the afternoon, I went into the dining room. The long wooden table, once used for large family dinners, now sat empty. A fine layer of dust coated its surface, interrupted only by the faint outline of two glasses that had recently been moved. I ran my fingers over the wood, tracing the absence. In the corner of the room stood a cabinet. Inside, I found a collection of old dinnerware, mismatched plates, chipped saucers, glasses with faint lipstick stains that hadn't been fully scrubbed clean. I didn't know why I opened it. I didn't know what I expected to find. But there, tucked in the back, was a folded cloth napkin. Inside it, a handwritten note. "Do you remember what we used to talk about at this table?" There was no signature. No name. Just the question. I read it twice, then folded it again and placed it back exactly as I'd found it. My hands felt cold. That evening, I stayed in my room. I didn't come down for dinner. No one came to check on me. No one knocked. The silence stretched long and wide, wrapping around me like fabric soaked in doubt. I lit a candle, one I found in the drawer near the bed, and placed it on the windowsill. I didn't cry. But I sat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, as if holding myself still would keep everything else from slipping further. At some point, there was a knock. Not loud. Just two soft taps on the door. I didn't answer. Footsteps faded. I blew out the candle, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a question that would never be asked. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was shallow, fragmented. I woke often, checking the hallway through the crack in the door, listening for sounds that never came. In one of those moments, perhaps near dawn, I thought I heard humming again. Faint. Familiar. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. And the house, once again, was pretending to be asleep. I woke to the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of metal clinking against porcelain. It wasn't alarming. It wasn't even strange anymore. It just was. The sounds and smells of this house had started to sink into me the way humidity does in summer, slowly, imperceptibly, until you realize everything beneath your skin is damp with it. I sat up, blinking away the heaviness behind my eyes. The day before had taken something out of me, though I couldn't say what exactly. Not just the walk, not just the note, not even the photograph. It was the accumulation. A slow wearing down. The floor was cold when I stepped onto it. The hallway outside my room was empty, quiet, but there was the faint murmur of voices drifting up from below. Muffled, indistinct. It wasn't arguing. It wasn't laughter. Just conversation, or something pretending to be. I didn't rush to join them. I took my time dressing, choosing a sweater I hadn't worn since arriving. It was soft, dark green, and a little oversized. Comfortable. Familiar. I brushed my hair, not carefully, but enough to feel somewhat assembled. Then I made my way down the stairs, one hand lightly grazing the banister. The wood was smooth from decades of use, worn into softness by all the hands that had come before mine. In the dining room, the table had been set. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 1 open bottle of wine even though it was barely past noon. My brother stood at the window, arms crossed loosely, gazing out as if the hills beyond had something to say. He didn't turn when I entered. My former husband was already seated, flipping through an old newspaper with exaggerated interest. I paused in the doorway. Something about the scene felt curated, like a photograph staged for a magazine that no one would ever print. The lighting was too warm, the arrangement too symmetrical. It was like being invited into a memory I didn't belong to anymore. I didn't know we were having lunch, I said, not quite directing it at either of them. My brother turned finally and smiled, the kind of smile that gave away nothing. Thought we'd all eat together for once. Like old times. That phrase scraped at something inside me. I didn't remember old times looking like this. I sat across from him, beside my ex. The food was simple of bread, cheese, roasted vegetables, but the silence between us made it feel ceremonial. Every movement felt deliberate. The way he passed the salt without looking. The way my brother refilled only my glass. The way no one spoke until the plates were almost clean. Eventually, my brother leaned back and said, "There's a trail behind the orchard. It's overgrown, but still walkable. You two should go." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a placement. Like chess. I didn't respond right away. I looked at my ex-husband. He didn't seem surprised. He simply folded his napkin, placed it on his plate, and stood. I followed. Outside, the sun was brighter than I expected, and the path was exactly as described, narrow, tangled in thorns and branches, barely visible beneath patches of moss and fallen leaves. We walked without speaking for several minutes, the only sound the crunch of debris underfoot and the occasional caw of a bird overhead. The trail curved sharply after a small slope and opened into a clearing that I had forgotten existed. There was an old bench here too, twin to the one behind the hotel, though more weathered and partly sunken into the ground. We didn't sit. Instead, we stopped at opposite ends of the clearing, facing each other with several feet of tall grass between us. He spoke first. "You've changed." It wasn't accusatory. Just a statement. I looked at him, at the way he held himself, a little more still, a little more tired, but still somehow familiar. "So have you," I said. He nodded, eyes scanning the treetops. "I thought coming here would feel worse." I didn't know how to answer that. It did feel worse, and better, and worse again, all layered over itself like sediment. I crossed my arms and looked down at the ground. "This wasn't my idea," he said after a pause. "Your brother called me." "I figured," I replied. Another silence. "I didn't come to fix anything," he added. "I don't even think there's anything to fix." That, somehow, was harder to hear than an apology. It made my breath catch for a moment, though I didn't let it show. "Then why did you come?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He took a step closer, then another. Not threatening, just reducing the space. I didn't move. "I don't know," he said finally. "Curiosity, maybe. Guilt. Habit." I watched his face. It didn't offer much. Maybe that was what had always been missing between us, transparency. Or maybe we'd just both gotten good at hiding things, even from ourselves. "Do you think he planned this?" I asked, not specifying who he was. I didn't need to. He nodded once. "Absolutely." That admission didn't shock me, but it did solidify something. My brother hadn't been passive in this. He'd built something here. Or rebuilt it. He'd orchestrated our meeting like a scene in a play he was too proud to direct openly. We walked a little farther, the trail growing steeper and more difficult. I stumbled once, catching myself against a low tree branch. He reached out instinctively, steadying me. His hand on my arm was warm, familiar in a way that made my skin tense. We didn't speak again until we were nearly back at the house. We kissed. The words left me before I decided to say them. I didn't look at him when I did. "I know," he replied. That was all. Back inside, my brother was gone again. The dining room cleared, the kitchen empty, the hallway silent. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, unsure whether to go upstairs or outside again. I felt hollow, like something important had been taken or revealed, I couldn't tell which. Later that night, I returned to the storage room. I wasn't looking for anything, but my feet carried me there anyway. The photograph was still where I left it. I stared at it longer this time. We looked happy. But I knew better. Sometimes smiles were just well-timed silences. Sometimes memories softened edges that were never smooth to begin with. I left the photo behind, turned out the light, and closed the door. The hallway waited. Still. Watching. And I walked back to my room, unsure which of the doors in this place still belonged to me. The following morning began differently. Not with quiet, not with questions, not even with hesitation. It began with a door left open. When I came downstairs, the back door, the one my brother said he had fixed, stood slightly ajar, letting in a breeze that carried the smell of damp leaves and the first signs of autumn. It wasn't just unlocked. It was wide enough that someone had stepped through and not bothered to close it behind them. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether I should shut it, walk through it, or pretend I never saw it open. Instead, I made coffee. Everything else felt like too much. The kitchen was still. The dining room untouched from the day before. I waited to hear the sounds of someone else, footsteps overhead, the rustle of newspaper, the clinking of dishes, but nothing came. It was as if the house had paused, waiting to see what I would do next. I drank my coffee at the counter. I didn't sit. My body felt too tense for comfort, and my mind wouldn't slow. I thought about the walk from the day before, about what he said and what he didn't. About the way he looked at me when I stumbled, about the way his hand rested on my arm just a second longer than necessary. It wasn't the kiss that unsettled me most. It was the familiarity. The ease. The way something long dormant came back without my permission. And yet, this morning, he was gone again. At least, I assumed he was. No car out front. No signs of him in the living room or hallways. The door opened behind me, that could have been him. Or my brother. Or no one at all. That was the problem with this place. Everything looked like meaning, but nothing came with an answer. I stepped outside barefoot, letting the cold of the stone porch wake my skin. The grass was still wet with dew, but the sun was climbing fast. Beyond the overgrown garden, a small trail twisted toward the edge of the woods. I didn't know where it led. That seemed reason enough to follow it. The path narrowed quickly, lined with fallen branches and weeds that snagged the hem of my pants. But I didn't turn back. I kept walking, one step after another, until the trees thickened and the light shifted into that cool, green tone I used to love as a child, the way forest light always felt quieter, as if sound didn't travel the same way beneath the canopy. I walked until I found a clearing. Not the same as before. This one was tighter, surrounded by younger trees, and filled with signs of life, broken acorns, birdsong, the occasional movement in the underbrush. There was no bench here. Just a large rock near the center, flat-topped and dry. I sat. For the first time since arriving, I let myself breathe without counting the reasons I shouldn't. My body settled slowly. My shoulders dropped. My fingers stopped curling around each other. I didn't think of him. I didn't think of my brother. I thought of myself, or at least the version of me I used to know. Before the divorce. Before the long stretches of silence. Before the sense that everything around me was just a series of places where I used to matter. At some point, I stood again. My legs were stiff, but I welcomed the discomfort. It meant I'd stayed still. That was something. I walked back the way I came, slower this time. Taking in the details. The curve of a tree branch like an arm raised to the sky. The way the roots broke through the dirt like veins. The sound of something small scurrying just beyond sight. By the time I returned to the house, the door had been closed. I paused on the porch, hand on the knob, trying to read that small change. It was shut now. But I had left it open. Someone had come and gone. Inside, I found my brother in the common room, flipping through a book he likely wasn't reading. He looked up when I entered but didn't speak. I didn't either. There was nothing to say. I poured another cup of coffee, even though I didn't want it, and sat in the chair opposite him. Eventually, he broke the silence. "You went for a walk." I nodded. "Feel better?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. He closed the book and set it aside. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it held something he'd misplaced. "I know this place does things to people," he said. That wasn't what I expected him to say. Not even close. I waited, letting the silence stretch. He continued before I could ask what he meant. "It holds too much. The memories. The stillness. It doesn't let you forget anything." He looked up then, met my eyes. "I thought it might help you to come back." "Help me." I didn't laugh, though I almost did. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and let the weight of his words settle somewhere deep in my chest. Help me. This wasn't help. This was exposure. He stood without waiting for a response and walked toward the hallway. At the threshold, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. "He's not staying tonight." That was all he said. Then he left. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't ask if he had arranged it. I didn't want to know. That evening, I stayed out on the back porch until the sun disappeared. I didn't light a candle. I didn't bring a blanket. I sat there, the cool creeping into my skin, the quiet rising around me like water. I watched the trees sway gently in the fading light, and I thought of all the things I hadn't said, to him, to my brother, to myself. At some point, I went inside. The house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that begged for attention. The kind that simply was. Upstairs, my room looked untouched. My bag still unpacked. The window slightly open. The bed neatly made, as if no one had ever slept in it. I didn't close the window. I didn't change into night clothes. I simply lay down, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. And for the first time since arriving, I wondered what I would do if no one ever came back. I didn't dream that night, or if I did, I don't remember. What I do remember is waking to the sound of rain tapping against the windowpane, slow, consistent, almost gentle. The kind of rain that didn't come with thunder or drama, just a steady reminder that the world outside was changing while I stayed still. I lay in bed for a while, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know what else to do. My limbs felt heavy, and yet nothing ached. I was resting in a body that no longer trusted stillness. The hotel was quiet when I rose. Not the kind of quiet that accompanied sleep, but the kind that felt abandoned. There were no sounds of footsteps in the hallway, no clatter of cups from the kitchen, no voice humming through the walls. Just the rain, soft and persistent. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing jeans and a wool sweater that smelled faintly of lavender and old drawers. When I opened the door to the hallway, I paused. His bag was gone. Not moved, not hidden, gone. I stared at the empty patch of floor beside the room he'd been using. A small circle of cleaner wood, slightly lighter than the rest, told me where the suitcase had stood. It was like a placeholder for something that had already exited the scene. Downstairs, the kitchen was just as I expected. Clean. Orderly. And used. The coffee pot was dry. The sink empty. Even the chairs had been pushed in neatly. It looked like no one had eaten here in days, though I knew we had just yesterday. Or was it 2 days ago? Time here was slippery, not lost, exactly, but folding over itself in quiet, irregular loops. I stood at the sink and looked out the window. The rain fell gently across the yard, pulling color from the sky and soaking the edges of the earth. It was beautiful in a quiet, unbothered way. I stayed there, unmoving, for longer than I care to admit, as if watching the rain might clarify something I still didn't understand. Eventually, I turned from the window and noticed a note pinned to the refrigerator. It was handwritten in the same simple print I recognized from every grocery list, every reminder over the years. Gone into town. Back later. Make yourself comfortable. No name. But I didn't need one. The note wasn't what caught my breath. It was the photo beside it, the one I'd left in the storage room. The one I had stared at, then turned away from. Now it was pinned next to the note like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. I didn't touch it. I made tea instead. Something herbal, unfamiliar. It didn't matter. I needed heat, something to hold. I wrapped my hands around the mug and wandered into the sitting room. The fireplace hadn't been used in years, but I sat near it anyway, sinking into the armchair that had grown soft from age and neglect. Hours passed. I watched the light shift through the windows, watched shadows drift across the floorboards. Occasionally, I sipped from the cup, though the tea had gone cold. I should have felt lonely. But I didn't. What I felt was something more complicated, not quite emptiness, but the quiet left behind after something finished. The kind of feeling that didn't come from being alone, but from finally realizing there was nothing left to wait for. In the afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the house. Not to look for anyone, but to take inventory. To mark what had changed. The back gate was closed. The garden had collapsed further. The tools on the side of the porch were missing, the ones my brother had supposedly used to fix the fence. Even the swing, which had hung crooked for days, was now perfectly still. Back inside, I climbed the stairs to the second floor and paused outside each room. His was empty. Mine was not. The door was open, and something about that felt like a violation. I hadn't left it that way. I was sure. But I didn't turn around. I stepped inside. Everything looked as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the bed was a single object, a bracelet I hadn't seen in years. Silver, thin, slightly bent near the clasp. It had been a gift, once. I had lost it long before the divorce. And now it sat there, clean, polished, deliberately placed. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. It wasn't about the bracelet. It was about being reminded that every version of me had been seen, the one who laughed, who argued, who forgot things, who loved too loudly. And the one who stayed, even when she shouldn't have. At dusk, I walked to the woods again. I didn't follow a path this time. I let my feet move where they wanted. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the trees dripped slowly onto the earth like they, too, were trying to shed something. I found a clearing, not the one from before. This one was different. Wider. Still. I stood in the center and tilted my face to the sky. Closed my eyes. Let the water settle into my sweater, into my hair. Let the cold wake up the parts of me I'd tried to quiet. By the time I returned, the house was dark. No lights on. No car in the drive. I stepped through the front door slowly, listening. There was no sound. And yet, something had changed. On the kitchen table was a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a small stone. I unfolded it without thinking. We spent the night together. No greeting. No explanation. Just that. I stood there, holding the paper, letting the words settle into my hands like dust. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I folded it again, smaller this time, and placed it in my pocket. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs without hesitation. I knew which room to go to. Not mine. Not his. The one that had always been locked before. Tonight, it wasn't. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing a room I hadn't seen since arriving, and maybe not for years before that. It was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps it had always been this size, and memory had simply stretched it to fit its own needs. The walls were a soft, faded gray, with faint outlines where paintings or photographs had once hung. A simple wooden dresser stood opposite the bed, its surface bare except for a ceramic bowl filled with dried lavender and two empty picture frames turned face down. The bed was made, tightly, with crisp white sheets that didn't match anything else in the house. A chair sat by the window, slightly angled as if someone had just stood up from it. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. The hallway offered enough illumination to see, and I didn't want to disturb the stillness that had settled into the space like dust. I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside, unsure of what I was doing, what I was hoping to find. On the nightstand, there was another note. Short. Simple. Typed, not handwritten. I bought the place last year. Thought maybe one day you'd want to come back. I read it once, then again. My fingers didn't tremble. I felt nothing and everything all at once. The layers of it, the timing, the orchestration, the silence. The way it was never spoken aloud, never offered openly, just placed here for me to uncover. Like so much else in this place. I sat on the edge of the bed, slowly, feeling the mattress give beneath my weight. It didn't creak. It didn't resist. It simply accepted. The room was too quiet to stay in, but I didn't leave. I stayed there, unmoving, letting the presence of the note, the room, the walls themselves press in around me. Not unkindly. Not harshly. Just insistently. Eventually, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The yard below was still damp, the grass darkened, the sky a dull slate color that hinted at nightfall without fully embracing it. The swing swayed slightly, though there was no wind. I stayed at the window longer than I meant to. My reflection was faint in the glass, soft-edged and unfamiliar. I reached up and touched my cheek as if that might tether me, might pull me back into the version of myself that existed before this house, before this return, before all of it. It didn't work. When I turned back to the room, I noticed the drawer on the dresser was open just enough to suggest it had been closed carelessly or, more likely, opened recently. I crossed the room and gently pulled it open. Inside, there was nothing at first. Just a folded piece of fabric, navy blue, smooth, familiar. I reached in and lifted it. One of his shirts. Pressed and folded as if waiting to be packed, or worn, or remembered. Beneath it, a folder. Plain. Manila. No label. I opened it. Inside were documents, real estate papers, closing forms, old letters folded into thirds. Receipts from hardware stores. A floor plan of the hotel. A to-do list with only some items checked off: repair west wing ceiling, replace light in room 3, Buy mattress for upstairs guest room. At the bottom, one item had been added in a different ink, make it feel like home. I stared at that last line for a long time. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. There were no tears left in me for this version of the story. Instead, I returned the folder to the drawer, folded the shirt carefully, and placed it back on top. I closed the drawer softly. When I stepped out into the hallway, the house had changed again. Not physically. But something in the air felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or just clearer. The kind of shift that doesn't come from movement, but from realization. Back downstairs, I walked to the kitchen and turned on the light. It buzzed slightly, flickered once, then held steady. I opened a cupboard I hadn't touched before, half expecting it to be empty. It wasn't. Inside were new plates, neatly stacked. Cups I hadn't seen in the other cabinets. A row of jars labeled in careful handwriting, basil, thyme, oregano. Someone had cared enough to organize this. To prepare it. To think about permanence. I closed the door and leaned against the counter. I was tired, not in my body, but somewhere deeper. The kind of tired that comes after a storm passes, when the sky is still, the trees are quiet, but everything feels a little broken in the aftermath. I walked into the dining room, drawn there without thinking. On the table was a single glass of water and a key. Not labeled. Not explained. Just there. I didn't touch it. I sat down across from it and stared, wondering what it unlocked, or what it didn't. The silence around me was different now. Not heavy. Not ominous. Just full. Later that evening, I opened every door in the house. Not looking for anyone. Just making sure nothing else was hidden. Nothing else was waiting. The rooms were still. Honest. Nothing moved. Nothing resisted. I ended in my own room, finally pulling the covers back, slipping beneath them with no hesitation. I didn't close the door. I didn't need to. I placed the key on the nightstand, beside the folded note I still carried in my pocket. Outside, the wind picked up, just enough to make the old windows groan. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time, I didn't wonder who else was listening. The next morning began with light, not noise. It poured through the window like it had been waiting for me to open my eyes, as if the house itself had softened overnight. I blinked against the brightness, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders before finally pushing it away. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, listening. The wind had quieted. The rain was gone. The world felt still, but not tense, just settled. I moved through the motions of the morning without thought. Washed my face. Brushed my teeth. Pulled my hair back loosely. Dressed in the same clothes from the day before, not because there was nothing else to wear, but because they still felt like mine. I didn't bother with makeup. I didn't look in the mirror longer than I had to. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm with sunlight and silence. The key I had left on the nightstand was now sitting on the windowsill, a quiet reminder that someone else had been there, or maybe I had done it myself and forgotten. I no longer questioned every detail. There was a peace in accepting the ambiguity. I made tea, not coffee. The water took longer to boil than I remembered, or maybe I was simply more aware of time now. I poured it into a chipped white mug with a faint gold rim and carried it outside. The air was cool, but the sun was strong, and for the first time in days, I felt no need to be anywhere else. I sat on the back steps and watched the yard. The grass had dried in patches, but dew still clung to the lower leaves. The swing was still. A few birds darted across the open space, disappearing into the trees beyond the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed on a road I couldn't see. For a long time, I simply existed. No thoughts, no decisions, no weight. Just the heat of the mug in my hands and the quiet rhythm of breath moving in and out of my lungs. Eventually, I rose and wandered down toward the path behind the house, the one I had walked a few days before. The trail was more familiar now, not worn, but known. My feet found the places to step without hesitation. The branches that once snagged my sleeves seemed to bend away slightly as I passed. The woods accepted my presence in a way they hadn't before. At the edge of the clearing, I stopped. Someone had been here. Not recently. Not carelessly. But there were signs. A small pile of stones arranged near the base of a tree. A clean patch of earth where the grass had been flattened. A few scraps of bark that looked like they had been peeled deliberately. Nothing intrusive. Nothing destructive. Just a trace. I walked to the center of the space and turned in a slow circle, letting my eyes take in every detail. The clearing had a stillness to it that felt earned, not forced. I stood there for a while, letting the breeze brush against my face, tug at my sleeves, remind me that I was part of the scene, not just an observer. Back at the house, I found the front door slightly open. Not wide, just ajar, the same way the back door had been days earlier. It no longer startled me. I pushed it gently, letting it swing inward on its own, and stepped into the cool shade of the entryway. The dining room table had been cleared completely. No papers, no cups, no notes. Just the smooth surface of the wood catching the light from the windows. The chairs were pushed in. The floor swept clean. There was no sign that anyone had ever sat there. I checked the common room. The same. No books out of place, no cushions disturbed. The house had returned to its neutral state, lived in, but untouched. In the kitchen, I opened the pantry and found a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, still warm. A small jar of jam rested beside it. I didn't question where it came from. I spread a slice carefully, sat at the table, and ate slowly, watching the way the light shifted across the tiled floor. Later that afternoon, I began to clean. Not frantically. Not with purpose. Just methodically. I dusted the hallway. Wiped down the banister. Shook out the rugs in the front room. It felt less like tidying and more like reclaiming, not ownership, but presence. The house didn't feel like a memory anymore. It felt like something I was allowed to inhabit. In the late afternoon, I found myself in the storage room again. Not looking for anything. Just curious. The folder was still in the drawer, the shirt still folded on top. But now there was something else, a notebook, thin, with a dark blue cover. I hadn't seen it before. I opened it slowly, expecting lists or dates or names. But inside were single lines, written sparingly, one on each page. Check the light in room 4. Don't forget the broken tile in the back hallway. Replace the curtain rod before winter. And then, toward the middle of the book. Don't tell her too much. Followed by. She needs to find it for herself. The entries ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed the notebook and set it aside. Not out of anger. Not even out of confusion. Just acceptance. The answers had never been hidden. They had simply been waiting for me to see them. That evening, I lit a candle in the common room. Just one. No reason, no occasion. I sat near it on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, watching the flame flicker and settle. The quiet didn't press against me the way it had before. It rested beside me, gentle and steady. I thought about what had brought me here. About what I had expected to find. Closure? Clarity? A sense of self? None of those things arrived neatly. But something had shifted. Something important. Later that night, as I climbed the stairs, I passed the room with the open door, the one that had always been locked until yesterday. I paused, just briefly, and looked inside. The bed was made. The note was gone. The room was ready again. I didn't enter. I continued to my own room, closing the door gently behind me. And for the first time since arriving, I unpacked my bag. Sweaters and jeans, the book I never read, the scarf I packed without thinking. I placed them in the drawers. Folded, organized, settled. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that had held so much of me these past days. It didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt mine. Not because I claimed it, but because I had finally stayed still long enough to belong. I woke before the sun. Not to an alarm, not to a noise, but to the quiet clarity of knowing it was time. The air in the room felt different, as if the walls had softened overnight, releasing whatever tension they had once held. I lay still for a moment, my hands resting gently on the blanket, listening to the silence. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was full, with memory, with breath, with the residue of everything I had lived in this house over the past days. The sky outside was still dark, but I could see the shape of the trees beyond the window, silhouetted against the first suggestion of light. I got up slowly, my body calm, not heavy. There was no rush, no plan, but still a sense of direction. I dressed in a sweater that smelled faintly of the drawer it had lived in, jeans that had softened with wear, and warm socks that slid easily over the floorboards as I walked down the hallway. The house was asleep. No creaks, no hums. Just the kind of stillness that doesn't beg for attention, but invites you to step through it carefully. I passed the rooms one by one, glancing into each as I moved. The open doors no longer felt like questions. They felt like invitations I had already accepted or gently declined. Nothing waited behind them now. Nothing unfinished. In the kitchen, the light was dim, the windows fogged slightly from the cool morning air meeting the warmer interior. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved from memory. The kettle filled easily, the switch clicked into place, and I leaned on the counter while I waited. The sound of water heating filled the silence just enough. When the tea was ready, I carried the mug to the back porch. I opened the door slowly, bracing for wind or cold, but the air that greeted me was mild, touched with the scent of damp wood and something faintly sweet, maybe the last of the lilacs, or maybe just the way mornings smelled in this part of the world. The swing sat still under the weight of dew. The garden, though still overgrown, seemed less chaotic in the soft light. The path I had walked so many times was visible now, etched into the grass like it had always been there. I sat on the steps, the mug warm in my hands, and watched as the sun began to rise behind the trees. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor here. The hotel, the land, even the air, none of it felt like something I had to fight against or surrender to. It simply was. And I was part of it. Later, I went back inside and opened every window on the ground floor. Slowly, one by one, until the breeze moved freely through the rooms. Curtains shifted. Papers rustled. The house exhaled. In the dining room, I cleared the table completely. Wiped it down with a damp cloth. Ran my fingers over the wood grain like I was trying to read it. Every scratch and dent had a story I didn't know, or maybe had forgotten. I let that be enough. I walked through the hallway with a small box in my hands. Inside it were the pieces I had gathered over the week, the notes, the folded photo, the bracelet, the key. I wasn't ready to throw them away. I wasn't ready to display them either. I just needed them contained, acknowledged, and set aside. I placed the box on the shelf in the upstairs hallway closet, nestled between an old quilt and a stack of unused light bulbs. I closed the door gently. That afternoon, I found myself in the front room again, sitting on the same velvet chair I had ignored for days. The fabric was worn in places, threadbare near the arms, but it held me without resistance. I didn't bring a book. I didn't reach for my phone. I simply sat and listened. The hotel didn't speak. But it didn't need to anymore. I thought of everything I had arrived with, not just the suitcase, the tired clothes, the silence between me and the past. I thought of how heavy I had felt stepping through the front door. Not from grief. Not from fear. From uncertainty. From the sense that I didn't know who I was without the version of myself I had tried to leave behind. But now, the edges of that version had softened. She still existed, the woman who came here broken, confused, full of regret. But she didn't feel so distant anymore. She didn't feel like a stranger. Just someone I had needed to meet again. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A car passed slowly down the road beyond the trees. It didn't stop. It didn't matter. The world outside still turned. I stood and walked to the window, watching the dust settle in the air behind the vehicle's path. The trees beyond shifted slightly in the breeze. I watched them for a long time. Evening arrived quietly. No grand colors in the sky, just a slow dimming, a gentle return to blue and gray. I lit a candle in the common room again, not out of ritual, but out of comfort. Its flame danced softly in the corner of my vision as I tidied up the last few things in the kitchen, washed the mug, dried the counter, folded the towel over the sink. Upstairs, I changed into my softest clothes. Cotton pants. A long-sleeved shirt I'd forgotten I packed. I opened the window slightly, just enough to let in the cool air, and crawled beneath the blankets with a sense of ease I hadn't felt in a long time. Before turning off the light, I reached into the drawer and pulled out the notebook, the one with the single lines scattered through its pages. I flipped through it again, slowly, then closed it and set it on the nightstand. I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling. No questions left to ask. No pieces left to assemble. Just the slow, steady rhythm of breath and time. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. And inside, the house held its quiet. Not waiting anymore. Just resting. Like me.